What would you do if your wife casually texted she'd be gone a week with her ex, and you responded with a photo hugging her single sister, saying, "No one's waiting, you're already replaced," only to discover she'd been pre-framing you as obsessed with that sister to justify her affair? My name is Grant Ashford, and I work the night shift as a concierge at the Riverside Grand Hotel, a position that most people assume involves nothing more than handing out room keys and directing lost guests to the elevator banks, but which actually requires a particular kind of observational discipline that I developed during my previous career in executive protection services, where reading behavioral patterns and detecting deception were skills that could mean the difference between a client's safety and a very bad outcome. The hotel job pays reasonably well and allows me to maintain a relatively stable home life with my wife Meredith, who works as a manager at an upscale yoga studio and who thrives on the kind of social validation and community engagement that comes from cultivating relationships with wealthy clients who treat their wellness routines with the seriousness that other people reserve for religious observance. We have been married for 6 years and live in a downtown condominium building that is managed by a homeowners association with the kind of Byzantine governance structure that would make a small municipal governance seem streamlined by comparison, complete with elected board members who take their volunteer positions with a level of self-importance that occasionally veers into the absurd. I opened my text history with her and scrolled back through recent conversations, looking for any references to upcoming trips or scheduling conflicts, and I found nothing, except the usual exchange of logistical information about grocery shopping and utility bills, and the occasional complaint about difficult clients at the yoga studio who treated the staff like personal servants rather than wellness professionals. The absence of any advance preparation or discussion about a week-long trip struck me as significant, and I found myself running through the mental checklist that I had used during my protection work to assess whether a situation represented genuine threat or simply routine deviation from expected patterns. I considered sending a response asking for more details about where she was going and when exactly she had decided to take this trip, but I recognized that any questions I posed at 2 in the morning would likely go unanswered until she woke up at whatever destination she had traveled to, and that the act of questioning itself would position me as either controlling or suspicious in ways that would allow her to reframe the conversation around my reaction rather than around the substance of her unexplained absence. Instead, I found myself thinking about the various ways that people create cover stories and establish alibis when they are engaged in deception. And I remembered from my protection training that the most effective deceptions are those that contain elements of truth and that anticipate the kinds of questions that might expose inconsistencies. I pulled up Claire's contact information and sent her a text message asking if she was awake and available for a brief conversation, knowing that as an ER nurse, she worked irregular shifts and might well be up at 2:30 in the morning, either because she was working or because her schedule had left her with inverted sleep patterns that made late nights and early mornings her most alert hours. She responded within 3 minutes saying that she was awake and asking if everything was okay, and I replied that I needed to ask her a favor that would probably sound strange, but that I would explain more when we spoke in person if she was willing to meet me during my break. Claire agreed immediately and suggested that she could come to the hotel since she lived relatively close, and since meeting at 2:45 in the morning did not leave many other venue options that would be open and appropriate for conversation. I told her that would work perfectly, and that I would meet her in the hotel's small business center, which was located off the main lobby and which provided a space where we could talk privately without being overheard by guests or other hotel staff. Claire arrived at the hotel just before 3 in the morning, and I met her at the entrance and guided her back to the business center, which was empty and quiet with its desktop computers sitting dark and unused and its printer humming softly in standby mode. She sat down in one of the office chairs and looked at me with an expression that combined curiosity and concern, and she asked me directly what was going on and whether this had something to do with Meredith given the late hour and the unusual request for an in-person meeting. I showed her the text message that Meredith had sent me about being gone for a week, and I watched Claire's face as she read it and processed the implications of a sudden, unexplained trip that had been announced via text message in the middle of the night without any prior discussion or planning. Claire handed my phone back to me and asked if I had any idea where Meredith had actually gone or who she might be traveling with, and I told her that I had suspicions but no concrete evidence yet, and that what I needed from her was something that would probably sound manipulative or petty, but that I believed would serve a specific strategic purpose in terms of how this situation was likely to unfold. I explained to Claire that I wanted to take a photograph of the two of us together that would appear friendly and casual, the kind of image that might be interpreted as evidence of closeness or intimacy by someone who is predisposed to read it that way, and that I wanted to send that photograph to Meredith with a message that would flip the script on her casual announcement by suggesting that I was not sitting at home anxiously waiting for her return, but was instead moving on with my life in ways that she had not anticipated or planned for. Claire looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read, and she asked if I was trying to make Meredith jealous or if I was trying to provoke some kind of reaction that would reveal more about what was actually happening. And I told her that it was something of both, but that more fundamentally, I was trying to establish a particular narrative framework that would shape how subsequent events and revelations were interpreted by the people who would eventually become aware of whatever situation was developing. Claire was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that what I was proposing felt like it had the potential to blow up family dynamics in ways that might be difficult to repair, and that she wanted to make sure I understood that she would be positioning herself in the middle of whatever conflict was emerging between me and her sister. I told her that I understood the risk I was asking her to take, and that I would not be making this request if I did not believe that Meredith had already made decisions that were going to blow up family dynamics regardless of how I responded, and that the question was whether those dynamics would be shaped by Meredith's narrative and timing, or whether I would have some agency in how the situation was framed and understood. Claire studied my face for several seconds, and then she said that she trusted my judgment, and that if I thought this was the right tactical move, then she would participate in taking the photograph, but that she wanted me to promise that I would keep her informed about what was actually happening as I learned more, because she did not want to be a pawn in a situation where she did not understand the full context. I agreed to keep her informed, and I thanked her for being willing to trust me despite the strangeness of the request. And then we positioned ourselves on the business center couch, and I held my phone at arm's length to take a selfie that showed both of us in frame with casual, friendly expressions, and with Claire's shoulder close to mine in a way that suggested comfort and familiarity. I had learned during my protection work that the person who maintains composure and controls the information flow in a crisis situation is usually the person who ends up shaping the narrative and determining the outcome, and I was determined to apply that principle to whatever was unfolding between me and my wife, even though the context was personal rather than professional. I spent the remainder of my shift attending to the minimal duties that overnight concierge work required, checking in 2 late arrivals who had missed their original flights and had been rebooked on red-eye connections, coordinating with the kitchen staff about a guest who had dietary restrictions that required special breakfast preparation, and monitoring the security camera feeds that showed the empty corridors and quiet public spaces of a hotel in the deepest hours of night. My phone continued to buzz periodically with incoming calls and messages from Meredith, and by the time my shift ended at 6:30 in the morning and I was preparing to drive home, I had accumulated 6 missed calls and 14 text messages that I still had not opened or acknowledged in any way. I walked out to my car in the hotel parking garage and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, and then I finally opened my phone and began reading through the messages that Meredith had sent over the past 4 hours. The progression of messages followed a predictable emotional arc that started with confusion and concern, moved through anger and accusation, and eventually settled into a kind of desperate pleading that suggested Meredith had realized that her casual announcement about a week-long trip had triggered a response that she had not anticipated or prepared for. I was operating from the same methodical documentation discipline that I had learned during my protection work, where the ability to reconstruct events and establish clear timelines often made the difference between credible testimony and dismissed allegations, and where physical evidence and digital records carried more weight than personal recollections or emotional assertions. I did not yet know exactly what Meredith was doing or where she actually was or who she might be with, but I knew that the pattern of deception I was uncovering suggested something more substantial than a spontaneous weekend getaway with college friends, And I knew that whatever the full truth turned out to be, I would need comprehensive documentation if I wanted to challenge her narrative or protect myself from whatever counter-narrative she might eventually construct. I checked our joint bank account next, logging into the online banking portal and reviewing the transaction history for the past several weeks to see if there were any charges that might indicate actual travel expenses or resort bookings or airline tickets that would correspond with the trip Meredith claimed to be taking. The bank account showed no recent charges for flights or hotels or any of the typical expenses that would accompany a week-long vacation to a resort destination. And in fact, the most recent significant charges were routine payments for utilities and groceries and the monthly maintenance fee for our condominium. What I noticed as I reviewed the minutes was that Meredith's name appeared frequently in connection with community events and wellness initiatives that she had proposed or coordinated, and that Trevor's name often appeared in close proximity to hers in the context of budget discussions and vendor approvals for the programs that Meredith was championing. The pattern suggested a working relationship that involved regular interaction and coordination around shared projects, and while there was nothing in the official meeting minutes that indicated anything inappropriate or personal about their collaboration, I could see how the structure of their HOA involvement would have created numerous legitimate opportunities for them to spend time together discussing community business without raising suspicion or requiring elaborate cover stories. I took screenshots of several meeting minutes pages that showed the pattern of their joint involvement in various initiatives, and I added those screenshots to my evidence file along with a note about how the HOA structure had essentially provided them with a ready-made explanation for regular contact and coordination that could be characterized as professional and community-focused rather than personal or romantic. I spent the next hour conducting what amounted to a background investigation into Trevor's current life circumstances, using the same open-source research techniques that I had learned during my protection work when vetting potential security threats or gathering information about people in a client's orbit who might pose risks or complications. I searched for Trevor's name on various social media platforms and found that he maintained a relatively active presence on professional networking sites where he shared articles about real estate development trends and posted updates about community projects he was involved in, but that he kept his personal social media accounts more private with restricted visibility settings that prevented me from seeing much beyond his basic profile information. What I could see from his public posts and professional profile was that he presented himself as someone who was civically engaged and professionally accomplished, and that he received numerous comments and endorsements from other people in the real estate and legal communities who seemed to regard him as a rising figure in local development circles. I ran a property record search using the county assessor's online database to see what information was available about Trevor's condominium ownership, and I discovered that he owned a 2-bedroom unit in one of the more expensive buildings in the downtown district, and that he had purchased the unit 18 months earlier using what appeared to be a substantial down payment that suggested either significant personal wealth or access to family money that had enabled him to buy into the luxury condo market at a relatively young age. The property records also showed that Trevor had no co-owners or co-borrowers listed on the title or mortgage, which indicated that he was single or at least not in a relationship serious enough to involve joint property ownership, and I made note of this detail as potentially relevant to understanding what kind of relationship dynamic might be developing between him and Meredith. What I found as I worked my way backward through several months of uploaded photographs was that Meredith had been relatively active in attending homeowners association meetings and events beginning approximately 4 months earlier, which corresponded roughly to the time period when Trevor would have been settling into his role as treasurer and becoming more integrated into the building's governance structure. Prior to 4 months ago, Meredith's attendance at HOA meetings had been sporadic and minimal, limited mainly to annual meetings or special sessions that dealt with issues directly affecting our unit. But starting in October, there was a noticeable increase in her engagement with community activities and her presence at board meetings and committee sessions. The shift in Meredith's level of HOA involvement coincided almost exactly with the timing of the resort photographs that she had uploaded and then later deleted and then re-uploaded yesterday to create the false impression of a current trip. And I began to wonder whether those October resort photographs had actually been from a trip that she and Trevor had taken together during the early stages of a developing relationship, and whether the decision to delete them in December had been a response to concerns about maintaining operational security and avoiding the creation of digital evidence that might be discovered and questioned. I had no way to verify that theory without additional information, but the timing alignment was suggestive, and it fit with the broader pattern of deliberate planning and evidence management that I was seeing in Meredith's behavior around the current situation. Claire had left the brunch feeling confused and somewhat offended that her sister was suggesting either that I was being inappropriate or that Claire herself was somehow encouraging or enabling that inappropriateness. But she had ultimately decided that Meredith was probably just going through some kind of personal crisis or insecurity that was causing her to see threats and problems where none actually existed. As I listened to Claire's account of this conversation, I felt several pieces of the puzzle click into place with an almost audible sense of recognition and completion, and I realized that Meredith had been engaged in what I recognized from my protection training as preemptive narrative construction, which was the practice of establishing a particular version of events or characterization of relationships in advance of any actual confrontation or exposure, so that when the eventual revelation occurred, there was already a framework in place that would support a preferred interpretation. Meredith had been setting up a storyline in which I was emotionally or romantically fixated on her sister Claire, and she had been planting that storyline with Claire herself and presumably with other family members or friends, so that when and if her own affair with Trevor was eventually discovered, she would have a ready-made explanation that positioned my supposed obsession with Claire as either the cause of her affair or as evidence that I was equally guilty of inappropriate relationships and therefore had no moral standing to judge her choices. We reviewed the key points that Claire would need to address, including her account of the brunch conversation where Meredith had planted the storyline about my supposed inappropriate interest in Claire, and we discussed how she would refute those characterizations by describing our actual interactions over the years of my marriage to her sister and explaining that nothing in my behavior had ever suggested anything beyond normal family friendliness and appropriate boundaries. Susan and Robert arrived exactly on time at 6:30, and I greeted them at the door and welcomed them into the condominium with the kind of warm hospitality that I had always tried to maintain with Meredith's parents, even during periods when my relationship with their daughter was experiencing strain or distance. They came in carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers, and Susan immediately asked where Meredith was and whether she had gotten back from her work trip in time to join us for dinner. And I told them that Meredith's travel plans had been extended and that she would not be joining us this evening, but that I had asked Claire to come instead because I thought it was important to have this family conversation even in Meredith's absence. I could see a flicker of confusion cross both of their faces as they processed this information and tried to reconcile it with their expectation that any serious discussion about marriage and future plans would necessarily include both spouses. But they followed me into the apartment and made polite conversation with Claire as we all moved toward the dining area where the table was set and waiting. Robert asked if I had any direct proof of a physical affair beyond what he described as circumstantial evidence about rideshare trips and photograph metadata, and I told him that I did not have photographs or recordings of intimate activity because I was not interested in conducting that kind of invasive surveillance, but that the pattern of behavior and deception was sufficient to establish that Meredith was involved in a relationship that she knew was inappropriate and that she was actively working to hide from me while simultaneously preparing a narrative that would justify her choices if and when the affair was eventually discovered or revealed. Claire spoke up at this point and told her parents about the brunch conversation from 3 weeks earlier when Meredith had planted the storyline about my supposedly inappropriate interest in Claire and my alleged pattern of making comments or asking questions that suggested an attraction that went beyond normal family relationships. Susan looked genuinely shocked to hear this account, and she asked Claire if she was certain about what Meredith had said and whether there might have been some miscommunication or misunderstanding about the nature of that conversation. and Claire responded firmly that she was absolutely certain about what had been said and that she had found the entire conversation strange and troubling at the time, but had not understood its purpose or significance until I had shown her the evidence of Meredith's affair and explained how the false narrative about Claire and me was designed to function as preemptive justification or deflection. Robert asked me directly if I had ever behaved inappropriately toward Claire or given Meredith any legitimate reason to be concerned about boundaries or attraction, and I told him that I had not, and that Claire could confirm that our interactions over the years had been entirely appropriate and consistent with normal family relationships between a man and his sister-in-law. Claire nodded and added that she had never felt uncomfortable or pressured in any of her interactions with me, and that the photograph that I had sent to Meredith in response to her trip announcement had been taken at my request as a strategic response to what I had already begun to suspect was a coordinated deception, and that she had agreed to participate in that photograph because she trusted my judgment about how to handle the situation and because she believed that Meredith's behavior warranted a strong and immediate response that would disrupt whatever plan she had been executing. Susan asked to see the photograph, and I pulled it up on my phone and showed it to both parents, and they studied the image carefully, and I could see them trying to assess whether there was anything in the photograph that would support Meredith's characterization of an inappropriate relationship, or whether it simply showed two people sitting together in a way that could be interpreted as friendly or familial rather than romantic.
Robert said that the photograph looked innocent enough to him, but that he could understand how Meredith might have interpreted it as provocative or hurtful, given that it had been sent in response to her announcement about traveling. And I told him that the provocation had been entirely intentional, because I wanted Meredith to understand that I was not going to sit passively waiting for her to return from wherever she actually was, and that I was capable of disrupting her narrative and her plans if she continued to operate under the assumption that I would remain ignorant or compliant. The conversation continued for another hour, with Susan and Robert asking numerous questions about the evidence and the timeline and the nature of my suspicions about Meredith's relationship with Trevor, and I could see them struggling to reconcile the image they had of their daughter as a responsible and honest person with the documented pattern of deception and manipulation that the evidence clearly demonstrated. Susan eventually asked what I intended to do with this information and whether I was planning to file for divorce or to attempt some kind of reconciliation that would involve counseling or mediated conversations about how to rebuild trust and move forward together. And I told her that I had not yet made final decisions about divorce, but that I was in the process of documenting everything carefully, because I believed that Meredith's pattern of behavior indicated someone who was not simply confused or making impulsive mistakes, but rather someone who was executing a calculated plan that involved relocating her life away from our marriage while maintaining the appearance of commitment until she was ready to make her exit on her own terms.
The lease application showed both Meredith's name and Trevor's name listed as co-applicants for a two-bedroom apartment in a building located about 3 miles from our current condominium, and the move-in date was listed as approximately 2 weeks from the current date, which meant that while Meredith had been sending me casual text messages about taking a week-long trip, she had actually been in the final stages of arranging a permanent relocation that would have been presented to me as a fait accompli once all of the logistics were in place, and she was ready to announce her departure. Susan took the phone from Robert and stared at the lease application photograph for a long moment before looking up at me with an expression that combined shock and disappointment and what appeared to be genuine confusion about how her daughter could have been planning something of this magnitude without sharing any indication of marital problems or relationship dissatisfaction with her own parents. She asked me if I had confronted Meredith about the lease application and whether she had provided any explanation for why she would be applying to rent an apartment with her ex-boyfriend while still married to me and while apparently maintaining the pretense that our relationship was intact and functional. I told Susan that I had not confronted Meredith directly about the lease application because I had only discovered it 2 days earlier, and because I believed that confronting her before I had assembled complete documentation and developed a comprehensive strategy would simply give her time to construct additional cover stories and to prepare defensive responses that would make it more difficult to establish clear accountability for her choices and actions. Robert asked what I meant by developing a comprehensive strategy and whether I was planning to take some kind of legal action or institutional action beyond simply filing for divorce and separating our household and financial affairs. I explained to both parents that Trevor's position as treasurer of our homeowners association created a potential conflict of interest situation, given that he had been working closely with Meredith on various community programs and had been approving vendor contracts and budget allocations that directly benefited initiatives that Meredith had championed, and that I believed there was a reasonable case to be made that their personal relationship had compromised his ability to make objective decisions about HOA business and had potentially resulted in preferential treatment or financial impropriety that violated the association's governance policies and fiduciary responsibilities. Susan asked if I was suggesting that Meredith and Trevor had been engaged in some kind of financial fraud or embezzlement scheme in addition to having an affair, and I told her that I was not making allegations about criminal activity, but rather pointing out that the structure of their relationship and their respective roles within the HOA created at minimum the appearance of impropriety that the board would be obligated to investigate if a formal complaint were filed by a resident who had standing to raise concerns about governance and financial management. Claire interjected at this point to say that she thought involving the homeowners association was a smart approach because it would create institutional consequences that extended beyond the personal and emotional damage of the affair itself, and that having Trevor's position and reputation at stake would put pressure on both him and Meredith in ways that a purely personal confrontation would not achieve. Robert looked uncomfortable with this line of discussion and said that while he understood my anger and my desire to impose consequences on the people who had betrayed my trust, he was concerned that escalating the situation into institutional complaints and formal investigations might create collateral damage that would affect innocent parties or that would make eventual reconciliation or peaceful separation more difficult to achieve. I appreciated Robert's concern about proportionality and collateral damage, but I told him that Meredith had made the choice to conduct her affair within the context of community governance and organizational structure, and that she had used HOA business as cover for spending time with Trevor and had allowed him to make decisions about budgets and contracts that directly affected programs she was involved in, which meant that the institutional dimension of their relationship was not something I was artificially injecting into the situation, but rather something they had created themselves through their choices about how and where to conduct their affair. Susan gathered her purse and the wine bottle they had brought and told me that she was grateful I had shared this information with them, even though it was painful and difficult to hear. And she said that she hoped I would keep them informed about any major decisions I made regarding divorce or legal action, because regardless of what happened between me and Meredith, they still considered me family, and they wanted to maintain a relationship that was not defined solely by my marriage to their daughter. Claire walked the parents to the door while I began clearing the dinner table and putting away the evidence documents, and when she returned to the dining room, she sat down heavily in Meredith's chair at the head of the table and said that she thought the evening had gone about as well as could be expected, given that we were essentially ambushing her parents with information about their daughter's affair and her plans to relocate with another man. I agreed that the parents had handled the news with more grace and openness than I might have predicted, and I told Claire that I thought having her present to corroborate the story about Meredith's preemptive narrative construction had been crucial because it prevented the conversation from becoming purely a he-said-she-said dispute about interpretation and perception. Claire asked me what my next steps would be now that I had informed the parents and now that I had confirmed the existence of the lease application showing Meredith's planned relocation, and I told her that I was going to spend the next few days finalizing my documentation and preparing a formal complaint to submit to the Homeowners Association board president, along with supporting evidence that demonstrated Trevor's conflict of interest and his potential misuse of his treasurer position to benefit programs and initiatives that Meredith was involved in. I explained to Claire that the HOA complaint was important not just because it would create institutional consequences for Trevor, but also because it would establish a public record of the affair and its connection to organizational governance that would make it much harder for Meredith to control the narrative or to frame the situation as simply a private marital dispute that had no broader implications or impact on other people.
Claire asked if I was concerned about how Meredith would react once she learned that I had involved her parents and that I was planning to file formal complaints with the Homeowners Association. And I told her that I expected Meredith would be angry and defensive and would likely attempt to accelerate whatever timeline she had been working with for announcing her departure and formalizing her relationship with Trevor. I said that part of my strategy was to force Meredith into a position where she had to react to my moves rather than executing her carefully planned exit on her own terms and according to her own preferred schedule, because people who are forced to react under pressure tended to make mistakes and reveal information that they would otherwise have kept hidden or carefully managed.
Claire helped me finish cleaning up from dinner, and then she prepared to leave. And before she walked out the door, she turned to me and said that she wanted me to know that she admired the way I was handling this situation with careful documentation and strategic planning rather than with explosive anger or vindictive impulsiveness. Claire helped me finish cleaning up from dinner, and then she prepared to leave. And before she walked out the door, she turned to me and said that she wanted me to know that she admired the way I was handling this situation with careful documentation and strategic planning rather than with explosive anger or vindictive impulsiveness, and that she thought my approach demonstrated both emotional maturity and tactical intelligence that would serve me well regardless of how this situation ultimately resolved itself. I thanked her for the support and for her willingness to involve herself in what was undoubtedly going to become an increasingly complicated and emotionally difficult family situation, and I told her that I would keep her informed about any significant developments or any responses from Meredith once the parents spoke with her about what they had learned during the dinner. After Claire left, I sat alone in the quiet condominium and felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past week settling over me like a heavy blanket. And I recognized that I was operating in a state of heightened analytical clarity that was probably masking deeper emotional reactions that would eventually need to be processed and acknowledged once the immediate crisis phase had passed and I had time to reflect on the ending of my marriage and the betrayal of trust that had precipitated that ending.
Donna also mentioned that she had overheard a conversation approximately 1 week earlier in the building parking garage where Meredith and Trevor appeared to be having some kind of disagreement or tense discussion, and that she had heard Meredith say something about Trevor using her, and Trevor responding with a comment about not realizing that things would get this complicated or that Meredith would take it this far. The overheard conversation fragment was intriguing because it suggested tension or conflict in the relationship between Meredith and Trevor that contradicted the image of a smooth and coordinated affair that I had been constructing based on the evidence of joint planning and shared living arrangements. And I asked Donna if she could remember any other details about the conversation or about the body language and emotional tone that had accompanied the exchange. Donna said that both Meredith and Trevor had seemed stressed and unhappy during the conversation, and that there had been a quality of accusation in Meredith's voice when she talked about being used that suggested she felt Trevor had misrepresented something or had failed to follow through on promises or expectations that she had been operating under. The fragment raised questions in my mind about whether the relationship between Meredith and Trevor was actually as solid and mutually committed as the lease application and coordinated planning would suggest, or whether there were underlying tensions and misaligned expectations that might cause the relationship to fracture under the pressure of public exposure and institutional consequences.
The conversation with Donna gave me new dimensions to consider regarding the dynamics between Meredith and Trevor and whether their affair was actually built on mutual commitment and shared vision for a future together, or whether it was something more transactional and unstable that had been held together by secrecy and the absence of external pressure or scrutiny. I thanked Donna for her willingness to share her observations and for her commitment to maintaining detailed records that could serve as credible evidence during the board's investigation, and I told her that I would let her know once Victor Lang had scheduled the hearing so that she could plan to attend and provide testimony if the board wanted to hear from residents who had witnessed relevant aspects of the situation. After leaving Donna's apartment, I returned to my own unit and spent the rest of Saturday afternoon thinking about the implications of what she had overheard in the parking garage and what it might reveal about tensions or conflicts within the relationship that I had not previously understood or anticipated.
The comment about Trevor using Meredith was particularly interesting because it suggested that she perceived some kind of exploitation or manipulation in their relationship, rather than viewing it as an equal partnership based on mutual attraction and shared goals. And I found myself wondering what exactly Trevor might have been using Meredith for beyond the obvious answer of sexual and romantic companionship.
The fact that Trevor held the position of HOA treasurer meant that he had access to building financial records and vendor contracts and budget approval processes, and the fact that Meredith had been actively championing various community programs and wellness initiatives meant that there had been numerous opportunities for Trevor to approve expenditures and contract arrangements that might have benefited organizations or service providers that Meredith had relationships with through her yoga studio work or her broader professional network. I began to consider the possibility that the affair had not simply been an emotional and physical relationship that happened to take place within the context of HOA governance, but rather that the relationship might have had a more calculated dimension where one or both parties were using their positions and their coordination to facilitate financial arrangements that served interests beyond simple community improvement and resident services. I returned to my evidence files and began reviewing the HOA meeting minutes more carefully with an eye toward identifying specific instances where Trevor had approved vendor contracts or budget allocations for programs that Meredith had proposed, and I started cross-referencing those approvals with information I could find online about the companies and service providers who had received those contracts. I told Trevor that I would be willing to meet with him for a brief conversation, but that I would not agree to withdraw my complaint or to modify my testimony based on anything he might say during that conversation. And he accepted those terms and suggested that we meet at a coffee shop near the building on Wednesday afternoon. Wednesday afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes before the agreed-upon meeting time and positioned myself at a corner table where I would be able to observe Trevor's arrival and where our conversation would be relatively private but still conducted in a public space that provided a level of security and documentation through ambient witnesses and security cameras. Trevor arrived exactly on time, looking considerably less polished and confident than he had appeared in his professional photographs and HOA board materials, and he sat down across from me with a cup of coffee that he did not drink and a nervous energy that suggested he was struggling to maintain composure and control over a situation that had clearly evolved in directions he had not anticipated or prepared for. He began the conversation by acknowledging that his relationship with Meredith had been inappropriate given his position as treasurer and her active involvement in proposing programs that required his approval, and he said that he understood why I would be angry and why I would want to hold him accountable through official channels that would create consequences beyond the personal and relational dimensions of the affair.
Claire and I walked out through the building's main entrance into the cool evening air, and we stood on the sidewalk for a few moments without speaking. And I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity that came from having completed a difficult process that had required sustained focus and emotional discipline over a period of weeks when every instinct had been pushing me toward either explosive confrontation or passive withdrawal rather than the methodical documentation approach that I had ultimately chosen. Claire broke the silence by asking me what I planned to do next in terms of the divorce proceedings and the separation of household assets and all of the practical logistics that would need to be addressed now that the public exposure phase had concluded and the private reconstruction phase was beginning. I told her that I had already consulted with a divorce attorney who had reviewed my evidence file and had advised me that Meredith's documented planning around the lease application and her financial coordination with Trevor would likely result in a relatively straightforward separation agreement that would not require extended litigation or contested proceedings, and that I expected we would be able to finalize the divorce within a few months once the mandatory waiting periods and procedural requirements had been satisfied. Claire asked if I had heard anything from Meredith directly since the hearing had concluded, and whether she had attempted to reach out to me with explanations or apologies or requests for some kind of private conversation away from the institutional and community contexts where her behavior had been so thoroughly documented and judged. Claire asked if I had heard anything from Meredith directly since the hearing had concluded, and whether she had attempted to reach out to me with explanations or apologies or requests for some kind of private conversation away from the institutional and community contexts where her behavior had been so thoroughly documented and judged.
I poured myself a glass of water and sat down on the couch and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. And I recognized that beneath the analytical clarity and strategic focus that had carried me through the evidence gathering and the institutional complaint process, there was a deep current of grief and loss that I had been pushing aside in order to maintain the emotional discipline necessary for effective documentation and presentation. My phone buzzed again with another incoming text from Meredith, and this time I opened the message and read it. And she had written that she needed to talk to me in person, and that there were things I did not understand about why she had made the choices she had, and that she deserved the opportunity to explain herself without the presence of boards and witnesses and family members who had their own agendas and interpretations. I stared at the message for a long moment, and then I typed a brief response, saying that everything I needed to understand had been revealed through the evidence and the testimony that had been presented at the hearing, and that I had no interest in hearing additional explanations or justifications that would simply be another layer of narrative construction designed to salvage some fragment of the image and the storyline that she had been building for months. I told her that all future communication should go through my attorney, whose contact information I would send her separately, and that I expected her to make arrangements to retrieve her belongings from the condominium at a time when I would not be present, so that we could avoid the kind of confrontational scene that would serve no productive purpose and would only create additional emotional damage for both of us. Meredith responded almost immediately, saying that I was being cruel and cold, and that I was refusing to see her as a complete human being with complicated motivations and genuine struggles, rather than simply as a villain in the story I had constructed about betrayal and deception. I read her message and felt a flicker of anger at the attempt to reframe my careful documentation of her actual behavior as some kind of reductive narrative that failed to account for nuance and complexity. And I replied one final time, saying that I had seen her as a complete human being throughout our marriage, and that it was precisely that complete vision of who she was and what she was capable of that had been shattered by the discovery of the systematic planning and manipulation that she had engaged in over a period of months while presenting herself to me as a committed partner who was working through normal life stresses and professional challenges. I told her that the complexity and the human struggle that she wanted me to acknowledge did not erase or excuse the choices she had made to deceive me and to use other people, including her own sister, as props in false narratives designed to protect her ability to pursue relationships and arrangements that served her interests without regard for the damage being inflicted on the people who trusted her. The night deepened, and I eventually moved from the couch to the bedroom, where I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened and everything that would still need to happen in the months ahead as the divorce moved forward and as I made decisions about whether to stay in this building and this community or to make a clean break and start over in some new location where I would not constantly encounter reminders of the marriage and the betrayal and the methodical process of exposure and accountability that had consumed the past weeks of my life. And as sleep finally began to pull me under, I felt a sense of completion that was not quite peace, but was perhaps the beginning of peace. The recognition that I had handled an impossible situation with as much integrity and strategic intelligence as I could muster, and that whatever came next would be built on a foundation of truth, rather than on the elaborate deceptions and false narratives that Meredith had constructed, and that had ultimately collapsed under the weight of documented evidence and institutional scrutiny presented in a public forum where her carefully cultivated image could no longer be sustained or protected from the consequences of choices that had seemed invisible and controllable right up until the moment when they became visible and undeniable to everyone who witnessed the hearing and understood what had actually been happening beneath the surface of community governance and marital partnership.